Hi, I'm Tristan, and in this course we'll be exploring the roots of feminism, social movements, and the resistance against anti-gender ideologies. Let's start by looking at how our society was shaped by centuries of struggle, inequality, and the fight for justice. Understanding feminism and resisting the anti-gender movement. Introduction. The society we live in today is a product of hundreds and hundreds of years of plights to justice, equality, and dignity. The social, political, economic, and religious systems that were rooted in societies historically oftentimes led to the privileging of a few and disadvantaging of the rest. The unequal allocation of privileges and benefits to people, groups, and societies and nations paved the way for deeply wounded societies in which people were divided, oppressed, discriminated, discouraged, persecuted, and violated. Public life traditionally belonged to the upper middle class, men, people from urban areas, the educated, and those who are white and able-bodied. Therefore, they managed to not only benefit from the system that privileged them, but also rig the chances of the rest to integrate and contribute to public life. As such, they maintained systems from which they benefited by continuously excluding and leaving out those who did not belong to the same category as them. The concentration of power to a handful of people who benefited from the system and who used their position of authority to oppress others fueled the oppressed to rise against such injustices and demand their rights and equal share in public life. People demanded their rights even in human eras when they should be beheaded, persecuted, or violated to do so. Therefore, the quest for equality is not a modern concept, it is rather an ancient one, which is developed together with politics, education, economics, religion, and societies. When a group of people unite with the purpose of changing behaviors and societies, dismantling power structures that oppress and discriminate, and fostering sustainable peace, they create a movement. There have been numerous movements that have changed societies globally and have altered the course of politics and economics. The right to vote, legalization of abortions, anti-slavery, anti-colonial struggles, civil rights, LGBTQ+ rights, environmental justice, and labor rights movements are just a few examples of the collective action that reshaped dominant narratives and challenged system inequalities. These movements often emerged from the margins led by those most affected by injustice and grew into powerful forces, redefining what justice, freedom, and dignity mean within and across nations. Change does not come without resistance or a heavy load on it. People remain in positions of power because they continuously and systematically maintain the structures that secure their dominance. A result of this resistance is the formation of anti-movements. Such efforts are designed, structured, and implemented to withhold power from spreading and shutting down those efforts that try to diminish existing power structures. True transformation requires more than policy shifts or symbolic gestures. It demands that those who benefit from privilege and power confront uncomfortable truths, engage in honest self-reflection, and be willing to redistribute the access to resources, decision-making spaces, and opportunities. This is rarely a natural or easy process. It involves difficult conversations, deliberate compromises, and a commitment to the collective well-being over individual gain. Yet, without these steps, inclusion remains rhetorical and justice elusive. In this online course, we'll be unpacking what constitutes a movement and the inception of feminism and its different waves across time and space. We will also elaborate on the impact of movements in society and contextualize them in Kosovo and other countries of the global south. Throughout the 3 modules of this course, we'll be talking about intersectionality and its importance, masculinities and how it is performed in society, and lastly, we will come to the conclusion that in order to tackle anti-gender movement and anti-feminist movements, we need to be persistent in asking for equity in social, economic, and political structures. So, let us start. Methodology. This online course is organized into 3 modules, each exploring a central theme through a series of interconnected subtopics. The course is designed to encourage critical self-reflection and sharpen your awareness of the dynamics within your community and broader society, drawing on global examples across different historical and cultural contexts. The content is thoughtfully contextualized within Kosovo to deepen local relevance and understanding. At the beginning of each module, you'll find a clear learning outcomes to guide your progress. Throughout the course, you'll engage with thought-provoking questions, interactive assignments, and quizzes designed to reinforce key concepts and support your learning journey. Who are our audiences? Audiences are individuals from all walks of life: professionals, civil society activists, aspiring change makers, and those already driving change are encouraged to join this online course. It offers a solid foundation in understanding social movements and anti-gender campaigns, equipping you with the essential knowledge and perspectives. Upon completing these modules, you'll be well prepared to deepen your engagement with these topics and apply what you've learned in your personal, professional, or activist pursuits. Here are some reflection questions before we start. Have you considered how society was shaped and what were some of the most important events that gave it this course? How do you define a social movement? What is feminine to you? Can you identify anti-gender propaganda and movements today? What are some aspects of power dynamics that you have oftentimes overlooked or benefited from, although unknowingly? Have you ever considered that knowledge, power, resources, and opportunities are usually located in the center, whereas the margins you can find discrimination, expulsion, and exploitation? So our first module is Understanding Feminist Movements, and the learning outcomes in this module will be these. So now, moving on. What is a movement? The world as we know it today has been shaped by centuries of powerful resistance, hard-won compromises, profound human loss, unjust imprisonments, and enduring of social stigma. But above all, it has been shaped by unwavering strength, the courage to persist, to challenge injustice, and to imagine a more just and equitable world. Even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, all of the rights we have today, the international laws, conventions, resolutions, local policies, and national action plans, all of them derive from movements throughout history. According to Britannica, a social movement is defined as a loosely organized but sustained campaign in support of a social goal, typically either the implementation or the prevention of a change in society's structures or values. Although social movements differ in size, they're all essentially collective. That is, they result from more or less spontaneous coming together of people whose relationships are not defined by rules and procedures, but who merely share a common outlook on society. So, movements are collective in essence, meaning that in order to reach a common goal and intended impact, people, individuals, and communities need to come together and many times unite in the premise of common oppression. Common oppression has been considered as a tool or mechanism to unite people based on common experiences, values, or ideologies with the purpose of liberation. When people go through the same lived experience, similar ordeals, or if they face the same kind of marginalization, it is easy to relate with other stories. Therefore, unification, in the name of oppression, comes more organically. Enslaved Africans united against the brutality of racial oppression. Women came together to challenge systematic gender equality. Albanians mobilized in the face of ethnic discrimination, and LGBTQ+ communities have organized worldwide to fight for recognition, rights, and dignity. Workers have joined forces to demand fair wages and safe conditions. Indigenous peoples have risen to defend their lands and cultures, and youth have led climate justice movements with urgency and vision. These alliances, rooted in shared experiences of marginalization, reveal the power of solidarity in confronting injustice and reimagining more inclusive, equitable societies. But can you be a part of a movement which fights for equality and not necessarily be a part of the oppressed? The answer is yes, and in case you are considered an ally. Allies and partners are important in pushing the equality agenda forward. Movements are not only created based on common oppression, there are people advocating for justice and equity even from positions of power. The world has changed due to such alliances. Through them, laws are passed and enforced, mindsets are shifted, divisions are bridged, and one unthinkable possibility become reality. These collective efforts lay the groundwork for most just institutions, inclusive narratives, and societies where dignity, equality are not privileges, but rights extended to all. Movements led by the oppressed and in solidarity and partnership with the allies have managed to ensure healthier and more protective workers' rights. Legalized abortions, abolition of slavery and segregation, raised awareness on gender-based violence, sexual harassment, and domestic violence. Greater representation in politics, critical reporting on instances of genocide and abuse, more equitable land rights, increased body autonomy, and the right to vote and receive education, and the list goes on and on and on. These individuals who have led powerful movements, many of whom have been forgotten due to the unjust and selective writing of history. However, some names have managed to endure, recognized as heroes and heroines for their efforts, sacrifices, and unwavering vision to create the change they wish to see in the world. Below we highlight some of the most prominent leaders of social movements: Sojourner Truth, Nelson Mandela, Emmeline Pankhurst, Malala Yousafzai, Martin Luther King Jr., Berta Kakaresh, Marsha P. Johnson, Mahatma Gandhi, Wangari Maathai, Jew the Human. These are only some of the people out of hundreds of thousands of activists who have led liberation efforts and pushed for equality. It's up to you to learn about their work, what they did, and what their legacy is. One day, people may be learning about you too. So, what are the ways of feminism? First and foremost, let us define what feminism is and what it entails. Feminism is a movement, which in reality is comprised of a variety of nuances and layers. In essence, feminism aims to eradicate all forms of violence, discrimination, hate, persecution, and unequal allocation of resources and opportunities. It advocates for equal representation in politics and public life and tries to dismantle several systems that interlock with patriarchy. This means not only does feminism stand for the cause of gender equality, it also includes fighting racism, ageism, ableism, classism, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, and other intersecting systems of oppression. The shape feminism has taken today is rooted in the principle that equality cannot be achieved unless all people, regardless of who they are, where they come from, and their position or economic statuses, should enjoy equal rights and opportunities. It is worth mentioning that there is no right or wrong of doing feminism, as long as you are not violating someone's right to exist, express themselves, and choose what to do with their life. This also connotes that feminism is a pluralist movement, meaning that there are different ways of achieving equality and ensuring that each voice is represented. Before we dig deeper into the ways of feminism, let's briefly stop and elaborate on the different movements within the feminism movement. Some examples are, so first, the Chicana feminism, a type of feminism which intersects race, gender, and class. It focuses on the experiences, struggles, and oppression of the Mexican people, especially Mexican women. Next, Black feminism. It asserts that feminism should be intersectional, namely to include the experiences and struggles of all groups of society. It was created as a movement after the exclusionary approach of white feminism, a type of feminism which considers women one homogeneous group. In essence, this type of feminism suggests that race and gender, when combined, results in multi-layered forms of oppression. Conservative feminism. This type of feminism combines traditional roles, norms, and values and advocates for women's empowerment within the framework. It is more essentialist and refers to the biological differences between sexes, which then determine gender roles. Radical feminism aims to deconstruct and dismantle all patriarchal structures which have been systematically and historically disfavoring women from entering and equally participating in public life. It also calls for a reform in all social constructs, including the way we experience and perform gender, to the reformation of the institution of marriage and family. Queer feminism. This focuses on deconstructing heteronormative, patriarchal, and sexist systems by analyzing the relationships between gender and sexuality. Disability feminism intersects gender and ability at its core. It suggests that the world is constructed for men and for able-bodied individuals. Thus, in order to achieve an equitable society, people and bodies, which are non-normative, should also be taken into account. Socialist feminism, rooted in the premise that patriarchy and capitalism are strongly interconnected. This type of feminism mostly focuses on the economic systems as a source of oppression. It further shows how the unjust and unequal division of labor are not only presented in the private sphere, they're also penetrated in the public one. Indigenous feminism focuses on the intersection of indigenous identity and gender. It also analyzes how colonialism and oppression of the indigenous people has led to their expulsion from public life. It aims to decolonize history, culture, norms, and traditions which have been molded and constructed by oppressors. White feminism, a form of feminism which fails to take into account the experiences and forms of oppression that concern all women. It rather focuses on the needs, experiences, and empowerment of the more privileged women, white, upper middle class, and educated, whereas women, who are at even greater disadvantage, are left out of the advocacy efforts. Ecofeminism, an ideology within feminist movement which combines feminism with environmentalism. Similar to other movements, it intersects two fronts, that being gender and environmental degradation, and argues how these two interconnected. According to this line of thought, women's rights are closely connected to the saving of the planet we live in. The table can continue to be filled with more approaches to feminism, each of which treats gender with one or more identity markers, which add to the layered oppression of groups and communities. As you can see, feminism is broad, nuanced, multi-layered, intersectional, and multidisciplinary effort. Depending on where you stand ideologically, what the intersection of your identity is, and what you believe in, you might find yourself in different points of the feminism ideological interval. Did feminism start as a movement with the current shape it has today? Simply, no, it didn't. It evolved with current political, economic, social, and technological developments and took the complex and multi-layered form it has today. Let us examine the waves of feminism throughout history. So, these are the waves. The first wave started between the late 19th century and the 20th century. The first wave of feminism built on the strategies, methods, and tactics of women who participated in the French Revolution and the abolitionist movement. Women in this time period advocated for the right of women to vote, and it was tied to the first Women's Convention that was held in 1848. Women who were a part of this movement were mostly privileged, white, and from upper middle class. Although the movement was exclusionary, efforts to include women in decision-making were crucial for the next wave. The second wave was the 1960s. After gaining the right to vote in the US, women across the state started to reduce their activism efforts. The US went through a period of domestication of women where women were encouraged to stay at home, raise children, while men took care and participated in public life. Women were facing great challenges while being pushed out to the public life, but the problem was not publicly or widely discussed. The second wave of feminism started as a revolt of this domestication. Building on the right to vote, women started requesting gender equality in the public life, bodily autonomy, and higher decision-making roles within households. The third wave was the 1990s. Given that the previous movements were generally calling for women's equal rights in politics, decision-making, households, media, and the economy by mainly focusing on the needs and experiences of women, of the majority who were more privileged, the need to create a more inclusive form of feminism emerged. This form of feminism is called intersectional feminism, where several layers of oppression are examined concurrently. The fourth wave started in 2012. In this era of feminism that continues to today, women aim to be represented meaningfully in public life, have bodily autonomy, freely express their sexuality, eliminate glass ceilings, gender pay gaps, eliminate gender-based violence, genital mutilation, and femicide. This movement is trying to dismantle patriarchy, ableism, white supremacy, and queerphobia. It is also important to note that the waves of feminism do not necessarily apply to all contexts and countries in this world. Depending on the state and place, the society of a particular country or region of the world was, the movement included specified contextual and local nuances. It is of course difficult to pinpoint the exact movements each wave of feminism started at, since it was built on the struggles and resistance of previous efforts. However, the waves help us to understand specific time periods in order to contextualize efforts. So now, in this module, we've explored the foundational elements of feminist movements and their role in shaping a more just and equal world. We learned that social movements are collective efforts driven by shared goals, often born from shared oppression, but not limited to it. Therefore, anyone can be an ally. We discovered that movements like feminism are dynamic and evolving with time, and are deeply intersectional, meaning they recognize how race, class, gender, sexuality, and other identities overlap to shape people's experiences. We met powerful leaders from around the world who, through resistance and vision, fought to transform societies. We also came to understand that feminism is not a single story. It includes many approaches and ideological perspectives, each adding depth, richness, and broader movement for equality. So, now our module assignment. Your assignment for this module is not only to reflect on the legacy of these movements, but to consider how we too can be a part of creating a meaningful change. Module 2, Power, Identity, and Inclusion. So, the learning outcomes in this module will be: our first topic will be intersectionality. In a considerable period from the establishment of the feminist movement, women were considered a homogeneous group, in which case the needs, struggles, and experiences were considered as universal and as if they belonged to everyone who identifies as a woman. However, as the movement grew, women of all backgrounds started expressing their dissatisfaction with the exclusionary approach of the women who were involved in the movement and who were calling for equal rights and opportunities for all women. What they're failing to take into account was the fact that oppression from patriarchy becomes even more complex when it interlocks with systems based which people are excluded, such as race, ethnicity, religion, class, health, and so on. The type of feminism which was considered to have an exclusionary approach was white feminism or Western feminism. This subgroup of feminist movement advocated for equal rights for all women, but they based their plight for liberation on the needs and experiences of white women, upper middle class, and those who came from Western countries. Black, Mexican, Roma, Muslim, disabled, or peasant women were generally left out of these calls for equality. As a consequence, the need to have a feminist movement which takes into consideration how different markers of identity intertwine with one another to oppress or advantage women emerged. This type of feminism is considered to be intersectional. But what even is intersectionality? Intersectionality was coined as a term by feminist law scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, who shared that as a practicing lawyer, black women came to her to ask for help in being represented in court when they sued the companies who had fired them. They based their legal arguments on the exclusionary and discriminatory company practices rooted in racism or sexism. However, the cases were being dropped when companies proved that they were not racist nor sexist. The reality was that the black people employed were men, whereas the women who were employed were white. This led to Crenshaw coining the term intersectionality, which refers to the combination of race and gender to discriminate black women. She delivers a powerful TED Talk on the topic, which is definitely worth watching. The name of this TED Talk is The Urgency of Intersectionality by Kimberly Crenshaw. However, intersectionality was only coined as a term from Crenshaw because as a movement practice, it existed long before it was named. For example, Sojourner Truth, the slavery abolitionist and women's rights advocate that we talked about before, practiced intersectionality in the first held women's convention in Ohio in 1851. The speech she gave, titled Ain't I Woman, is a remarkable articulation of the struggles of black women who were not treated in the same gentleness as white women, but even not considered human in many instances when they were forced to do heavy labor. In this powerful speech, Truth asks,
"Nobody ever helps me in the carriages or over mud puddles or gives me in the best place. Ain't I a woman? Mm-hmm. Look at me. Look at my arms. I have plowed and planted and gathered in the barns, and no man can head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman?
Ask the question, ain't I a woman? 174 years ago, but this question is still valid today. Women from marginalized communities are continuously left out of efforts to be integrated, and their representation in many cases is merely numerical and not substantial. So now let's discuss the difference between equity and equality. This discussion can be illustrated by the figure on screen. in which the bubbles labeled with one identity marker overlap with or are distanced from the rest. Each of these identities, when combined with one another, leads to a series of advantages and disadvantages. This brings us to the equity versus equality part of the discussion. When we first hear these two terms, they sound identical, similar, the same, but in practice they are not. Equality refers to the equal distribution of opportunity, resources, information, insights, and power, whereas equity refers to the extra help which is needed for some individuals, groups, or communities to have an equal start with the rest of the non-marginalized. What does this mean in practice? Say we have 1,000 euros. We want to give to society to empower women in Kosovo to start a business. But let's say now, let's give 500 euros to a woman that already has a business, and the other 500 to one that wants to start a business. This is an example of equality. Both have wants, both get the same amount of money. Okay. However, if we take into account the rich woman may need less financial support to increase her capacities and expand her business, but the poor woman needs more financial support to even start. This is an example of equity. Equity has impacted societies worldwide because it was used as a tool or mechanism to ensure representation, presence, accountability, and transparency. The principle of equity is usually enforced through positive discrimination or affirmative measures such as quotas, financial incentives, scholarships, memberships, and training. These are targeted strategies which address the gaps in representation, but also take into account the structural and systematic barriers which prevent non-majority communities from fully being present and engaging meaningfully in public life. So now, some movements in Kosovo. Kosovo is a country that is still recovering from the wounds of war, which took place in 1998 and 1999, as well as the ethnic oppression which preceded the war. Albanians in Yugoslavia were considered as inferior to other ethnicities, which resulted in continuous oppression and exclusion led to increased dissatisfaction among Kosovo Albanians, who decided to speak up and rise against the oppression by demanding equal rights and liberation from the Milosevic regime, which included torture, imprisonment, killing, poisoning, closing of schools, reduced healthcare, and many other things for Albanians, and an unjust firing of thousands and thousands of people. Below, we are listing some core movements that shaped Kosovo's history. So, the first movement I'll talk about is the student movement. On March 4th and March 11th, 1981, student protests erupted in Pristina, initially sparked by demands for better conditions in the university cafeteria. However, they quickly escalated into widespread demonstrations with political slogans such as Kosovo Republic. These protests spread across Kosovo and into other Albanian populated areas of former Yugoslavia. Fueled by poverty, youth unemployment, and the lack of ethnic, political, and economic rights for Albanians, the Yugoslav authorities responded with brutal force, resulting in dozens and dozens of deaths, hundreds of injuries, and mass arrests. A state of emergency was declared, and a high-level political purges took place in Kosovo leadership, who was accused of not reacting firmly enough against Albanian nationalism. The 1981 protests remain one of the most significant events in Yugoslav's history after Tito's death, ending a blood feud, the Pajtimi I Gjorgjeve blood feud reconciliation movement, launched in 1990 by Anton Cheta, which was a powerful act of national unity in Kosovo. Aimed at ending century-old blood feuds, it united people across ethnic Albanian regions in the name of liberation and solidarity. Many women and girls actively participated, helping to reconcile families, especially in rural areas, and ending long-standing hostilities. This movement became a symbol of collective strength and paved the way for broader national resistance. So, we also have the Women's Forum, a bunch of Democratic League of Kosovo. This forum mobilized women to participate actively in political struggle, provide humanitarian aid, and promote gender equality. The women involved in the movement were fighting against two intertwined systems of oppression simultaneously, both ethnic oppression imposed by external forces and the entrenched patriarchy within their own society. Their visible presence in public and political life helped break down traditional class and gender divisions, fostering a sense of unity and solidarity across social lines. This collective mobilization emphasized the importance of both national liberation and the affirmation of a shared national identity, transcending previous social barriers and reconfiguring the social landscape. through the intersection of gender and ethnic struggle. Our next movement was the education of women and girls. The education of women and girls became a central focus, with many intellectuals traveling from village to village alongside civil society and gender rights activists to raise awareness about the importance of schooling. Given that Kosovo had the lowest literacy rate in Yugoslavia, this lack of education created greater vulnerability to oppression. In response to this, numerous initiatives emerged aimed at actively promoting and increasing access to education for women and girls, recognizing education as a vital tool for empowerment and resistance against both ethnic and gender-based discrimination. We also had house schools. In Kosovo, house schools became a powerful act of resistance against the regime's efforts to assimilate and marginalize the Albanian population. As formal education institutions were closed or heavily controlled, families and communities transformed their homes into secret classrooms where education at all levels, from primary to higher learning, was conducted discreetly. These house schools operated in silence to avoid detection, preserving the right to education and cultural identity in the face of repression. By opening their doors, parents, teachers, and activists ensured that young people, especially girls and marginalized groups, were not excluded from learning opportunities. These movements erupted in the times of oppression and war. However, Kosovo continues to have barriers and unequal representation of people from all backgrounds in society. Even after 25 years from its liberation, women's labor force participation remains the lowest in the region, with only 22% actively engaged in the labor market. On average, women perform 6.2 hours of unpaid labor daily and earn just 74 cents for each euro that men earn. In addition to gender-based disparities, the country continues to struggle with a systematic homophobia and deeply rooted anti-Gypsyism, reflecting broader social exclusions that hinder genuine progress towards equality. In response to this, civil society actors, human rights defenders, and marginalized communities are actively advocating for equitable access and inclusion across all sectors of society. Today's movements are calling for the removal of stigma against survivors of wartime sexual violence, the abolition of the 18% luxury tax on menstrual products, the full implementation of gender parity in Kosovo Parliament, the development of infrastructure accessible to people with disabilities, the amendment of labor laws to ensure equitable parental leave, the closing of gender pay gaps, and fair and inclusive representation in the media, among many of other demands for justice and systematic reform. The conclusion to all of this is that this module has explored the interplay between power, identity, and inclusion, emphasizing the importance of intersectional thinking in dismantling systems of oppression. Through historical and contemporary examples, from Sojourner, Truth-Defying Question, Ain't I Woman, to Kosovo's movements for education, gender equality, and minority rights, we remind that the struggle for justice cannot be separated from the lived realities of those most affected by marginalization. As we move forward, you are encouraged to recognize privilege, advocate for structural equity, and champion inclusive practices that center the voices and needs of those at the intersections of oppression. So, for this module assignment, choose an area of public life in Kosovo, which entails politics, economics, education, or healthcare, and identify what are the structural barriers that prevent queer people from equally participating in your area of choice. Then choose one mechanism that would ensure equity in that regard. Module 3. Anti-Gender Movement and the Future of Feminism. The learning outcomes in this module will be this. Reflect on the rise of toxic masculinity and its reinforcement through anti-gender rhetoric and political discourse. anti-gender movements. We began this online course with the premise that oppressive systems persist because those in power actively maintain them, often by creating barriers that exclude individuals outside the majority. These systems serve their interests, and as such, those who benefit from them are typically resistant to change, especially when that change threatens to redistribute power or create space for non-traditional voices and identities to be included. We also discussed that when we talk about gender, we are not only referring to the binary categories of men and women. Gender is deeply interconnected with the other aspects of identity, including sexual orientation, age, class, ethnicity, race, education, ability, and more. Thus, when we talk about anti-gender movements, we need to keep in mind that the anti-movement means much more than the binary categories of men and women. The anti-gender movement is comprised of many stakeholders, from the political leaders to entrepreneurs, organizations, institutions, and individuals who share a set of values and visions that are more conservative and traditional. This movement is a direct response to the diversity and inclusion agenda, by which they aim to raise awareness on the threat that the gender ideology poses to the institution of the family, marriage, and roles in society. Most widely, the anti-gender movement is lobbying against the acceptance and representation of the LGBTQ+ people, reproductive rights, gender, and diversity programs. The anti-gender movement risks to undo or make regress on all of the achievements feminists have managed to secure so far, starting from the rights to abortions and assisted fertilization to gender-sensitive education, countering gender-based violence, sexuality, and women's representation in politics. The rise of far-right ideologies in the US and Europe has undoubtedly intensified the anti-gender movement, by which political leaders are campaigning with promises which are gender-blind, sexist, homophobic, nationalist, and comprised of hate speech. According to the Gender Equality and Backlash report conducted by the UN in 2020, 3 main conservative groups were identified to be leading the anti-gender movement. There were governments, civil society, and religious groups who had formed international and cross-border alliances with the aim of shutting down the gender equality agenda. This anti-gender movement has unfortunately penetrated the globe and has involved local stakeholders which have been united with other global communities in the principles of uniting the family, protecting religious values, and returning the biological order. The anti-gender propaganda includes using protests, audio-visual media content, religious services, petitions, and social media to engage citizens and influence them. But what does the anti-gender movement mean in practice? First, we have reproductive rights. Women's bodies has been traditionally instrumentalized for political, economic, and religious causes. Their bodies have usually been rendered to their reproductive functions, while having their agency to decide what to do with their bodies stripped away from them by society. In many cases, globally, women continue to face difficulties to access safe and legal abortion. Restrictive policies and laws such as those in the US or Poland have made it increasingly difficult for women to exercise autonomy over their own bodies, often forcing them to seek unsafe procedures or carry out unwanted pregnancies to term. These laws are frequently justified through moralistic or ideological arguments, but they disproportionately harm marginalized women, especially those with limited access to healthcare, information, or financial resources, deepening existing inequalities and undermining basic human rights. Another important issue in this context is the accessibility of in vitro fertilization, also known as IVF. This medical advancement has enabled many women who might not otherwise be able to conceive to become parents. It has also created new possibilities for single women and same-sex couples to start families. However, IVF continues to face resistance due to traditional notions of family and relationships, often rooted in religious beliefs and historical norms. Such opposition has been evident in Kosovo, where the draft of law on reproductive health and medically assisted fertilization failed to pass in the assembly due to a lack of votes. It was the conservative wing of the parliament who constantly opposed the draft law. Our next point is gender and sexuality education. Education on sexuality and terms of gender has been frowned upon by conservative groups. According to human rights defenders, it is important to have gender and sexuality education integrated into curriculum because it increases awareness among young people on the changes that are happening in their bodies, their sexual drive and needs, safe intercourse, consent, and healthy, intimate relationships. However, due to the perception that this education may encourage early sexual activity or challenge traditional gender norms, many conservative actors oppose its inclusion in school curriculum. They often argue that such topics should be reserved for family setting or omitted altogether. Through reduced funds, removal of gender mainstreaming mechanisms, and introduction of new laws and policies, governments are strategically removing the topic from public discourse. Kosovo is no exception. The conservative groups in society were strongly speaking against sexual education classes and segments of curriculum, which forced the Ministry of Education to remove it from the curriculum entirely. Our third point is representation. Policies and laws that are gender blind, meaning they don't take into account the special needs, obstacles, and experiences of people of marginalized groups, lead to the lack of representation of all groups of society in decision making. When marginalized groups are excluded from representation, their voices are absent from the design and implementation of policies that directly shape their lives. This exclusion fosters resentment and dissatisfaction, deepening societal divisions and undermining efforts to build inclusive and sustainable peace. Without inclusive policymaking, systematic inequalities are perpetuated and legitimacy of institutions is weakened. Ensuring diverse voices are heard is not only a matter of justice, it is essential for social cohesion and democratic resilience. Our next point is gender equality representatives. The growing polarization of public debates and deepening societal divisions have intensified both verbal and physical violence between conservative groups and gender equality advocates. This troubling trend has fueled the spread of hate speech and normalized escalation of discourse into hostility, pushing dialogue beyond the point of constructive engagement. When society is exposed to hate speech and violence among and from politicians, civil society activists, and groups of interest, this causes a normalization of violence within households, gender-based violence, and the violence against women and girls. Our next topic will be masculinity. According to Raven Connell, there are 4 forms of masculinity in society. These forms are hegemonic masculinity, complicit masculinity, subordinate masculinity, and marginalized masculinity. Among these 4 types, hegemonic masculinity, often referred to in everyday language as toxic masculinity, is the most dominant form. It legitimizes the dominance of men and boys by encouraging assertiveness, emotional suppression, and at times aggressive or violent behavior, often at the expense of empathy and equality. Patriarchy has been formed by the enforcement of hegemonic masculinity in society and is maintained precisely by this structure. Gender equality activists and the gender agenda continues to be the dismantlement of this type of masculinity and the construction of a type of masculinity which is healthy for society and by which men are considered allies to the cause. Unfortunately, the present anti-gender discourse is only contributing to the further rooting of toxic masculinity in societies. What can we do to keep the feminist movement going, though? Fighting for a more just and equitable world is neither easy nor emotionally light, yet it is necessary, and we must continue building on the hard-won progress of those before us, ensuring that we don't allow regression. Across the world, hundreds of thousands are working toward shared feminist goals, so let us be strategic and intentional in maximizing our collective impact. Here are a few ways to do that. First, let's stay informed about the anti-gender movement and the forces fueling its rise. Building bridges by fostering dialogue, nurturing solidarity, and creating alliances across sectors and identities. Speak regularly to your family, friends, and peers about gender equality and how to engage society gender-responsive ways. Exercise your civic responsibility by voting for leaders who genuinely support gender equality and inclusive policies. Avoid engaging in hate speech. Instead, let's promote constructive, respectful communication, even indiscriminate. You must also engage with young people and don't shy away from the challenging older generations with empathy and patience. Check in on a fellow activist. A few words of support can go a long way in sustaining the movement. And of course, you must reject stereotypes and refuse to spread misinformation. When you see fake news, report it to the proper platforms and authorities. You must also show solidarity, not just in the words but in actions. Reflect critically on your own position, privilege, and role within the movement. Now to close off, the rise of the anti-gender movement represents not just a backlash against feminist progress, but a coordinated attempt to reassert patriarchal and exclusionary power structures. It threatens to roll back vital achievements in areas such as reproductive rights, education, political representation, and protections against gender-based violence. Yet, history reminds us that feminist movements always flourish through solidarity, resilience, and relentless questioning of power. Moving forward, we must remain vigilant, strategic, and united by engaging in informed dialogue, building alliances, and nurturing the next generation of feminists and allies. We ensure that the feminist project remains not only alive, but transformative. The future of feminism depends on all of us, our courage to speak, our courage to commit and to act, and our refusal to accept regression as the norm. Our assignment for this module is this. Based on what you've learned on this course and the current anti-gender trends, tailor a strategic plan on how to engage with members of your community to promote one specific cause. It can be discussing the importance of sexual education, talking about the elimination of femicide and gender-based violence, or countering toxic masculinity. I want to thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoy this lesson. Let's all come together and keep this movement going.